In recent years, this image began circulating on the internet, showing Pope Francis sitting behind a massive sculpture that at first glance appears quite frightening, and which many people interpret as a demonic statue, a representation of the devil himself. But despite the Pope being considered God's greatest representative on earth, seen by all as a holy man in authority in whom the faithful can trust to follow the Almighty's commandments, there are still various controversies and mysteries surrounding these men who chose to follow a life dedicated to Catholicism. Moreover, over the years, there have been several popes who were accused of supposedly being God's enemy, a disguised blasphemer infiltrated in the church, and even the false prophet described in biblical prophecies. This really happened with several popes, the most recent being Pope Francis, but there's a major caveat because there's something much more powerful and ancient than any pope that has ever existed. And I'm talking about the Vatican, an institution that has literally been shaping how the world and our society functions for dozens of centuries, influencing your life in ways you can't even imagine. When we talk about the Vatican Secret Archives, people generally imagine a small corridor underneath St. Peter's Basilica that you can only enter with a key and by opening a simple wooden door. Maybe some extra protection, a security system. However, believe it or not, the Vatican Secret Archives consist of an incredible and surreal 85 kilometers of shelves containing millions of documents. In other words, it would be humanly impossible for someone to read all these files. But the million-dollar question is this: what documents are being kept there? Despite the speculations, the official version is that the archives basically contain correspondence between popes and ancient kings, emperors, and heads of state, records of ecclesiastical trials, such as the trial of Galileo Galilei, who they wanted to condemn because he believed the earth revolved around the sun, plus documents from the period of the Crusades and the Inquisition, and various other less important files like baptism records, decrees, and general administrative reports. But of course, there are thousands of people who believe the archives aren't just that, because if they were, they probably wouldn't be so heavily guarded with such extremely restricted access. So, among the speculations about what documents the Vatican has been hiding from the rest of the world all this time, they would consist of proof of extraterrestrial contact, documents about descendants of Jesus, apocryphal or censored Bible texts, and secrets about Templar treasures. In fact, the most well-known apocryphal text of all is precisely the Book of Enoch, which portrays that in the past, alien beings supposedly came to our planet to mess with the entire order pre-established by the Creator, and thus divert humanity from the paths God had planned for us. And it's quite interesting how this apocryphal text relates alien beings to the fallen angels described in the Bible itself, suggesting they were the same thing. Anyway, without straying from the subject of the Vatican Secret Archives, Pope Francis took action regarding all these conspiracies to try to reduce or lessen the number of people accusing them of hiding important information from humanity. That's why in 2019, he chose to change the name from Vatican Secret Archives to Vatican Apostolic Archives. This way, the documents received a much less conspiratorial name. And indeed, the old name really was that because they were officially called Secret Archives. However, the detail is that in Latin secretum doesn't mean secret in the sense of hidden, but rather in the sense of private or personal. In other words, they were the Pope's personal files and not something forbidden to the public. In fact, it is possible to access the archives, even if you're not part of the Vatican. However, only accredited researchers, such as historians and theologians, can request access. But here's another detail that may favor conspiracy theories, since access is only permitted to documents that were written up to 75 years before the request date. And this is basically a huge bucket of cold water, because there would be no way to access the documents that really matter from centuries ago. So in the end, we're 90% certain that there are several documents there that would change the course of history if publicly disclosed. However, the severity of these documents is what becomes the subject of debate and speculation, because it could be something more moderate, such as popes who committed great sins and were covered up to avoid tarnishing the image of the Church and the Vatican, or even more serious and much graver things than that, such as proof of extraterrestrial life that is supposedly being hidden from humanity with the Vatican's help. Now, moving on to the second topic, but one that relates to the first we just covered. On one of Pope Francis's trips to Chile, he appeared wearing vestments that had a very contradictory symbol, seen as minor heresy and blasphemy by various Catholics and Christians around the world. And you must be wondering, what's wrong with these vestments? The answer is quite simple. It turns out that this little being with antennae on its head is none other than the Atacama Giant, a hieroglyph of an incredible 119 meters in height, drawn on the ground of the Atacama Desert located in Chile, the country the Pope was visiting on that occasion. So in ancient times, the Chilean peoples who lived in the region drew this hieroglyph to honor the god they worshipped at that time. And that's why Francis's action received a huge number of criticisms, because in the opinion of Catholics and Christians, the Pope was practicing paganism and committing great blasphemy, especially since the Chilean peoples of that time performed human sacrifices to their gods, making the Pope's action even worse. However, the official version is that Francis placed the design on his vestments to honor the culture and Chilean people. But the big question is that he could have made this tribute in various ways that wouldn't cause so much controversy, such as placing the Chilean flag on the vestments or any other cultural symbol that didn't refer to paganism, especially because this idea of wanting to unify religions for the sake of peace is seen as the plan of the Antichrist and the false prophet for the end times, because this way they would create a single world religion, and the Antichrist would be the center of worship of this unified and global religion. And remember, this is also a theory. Moreover, looking at this drawing of the Atacama Giant, it's almost impossible not to automatically relate it to an alien being, because it looks a lot like an ET with little antennae on its head. This reignites that old debate about the Vatican and their relationship with ufology. Moving on to another subject, but still involving this whole UFO question, you may have already heard that the Vatican has a telescope called LUCIFER. Well, this story isn't completely true nor completely false. Calm down, I know you must be confused, but I'll explain very calmly. The Vatican really does have an advanced technology telescope called VAT, meaning the instrument's name isn't the same as the devil and really isn't even a similar name. Does this detail mean that everything was just a misunderstanding or false information spread on the internet with the aim of causing controversy? The answer is no, because although the telescope is called VATT, there's another instrument that assists in space studies, and this one is indeed called LUCIFER. So it's that old saying, people exaggerate, but they don't invent. Well, an infrared instrument received this name as an abbreviation of another, which would basically be its full name. But this is just the official version, because according to conspiracies, the people involved in creating the equipment gave it this extremely large and complex name, supposedly to later abbreviate it to Lucifer, and thus have an excuse to give to whoever called them followers of the evil one. And I know that right now, you must be thinking that Lucifer isn't the devil's name, because Lucifer actually means light bearer. In some contexts and interpretations, it could be a reference to Jesus Christ. However, the truth is that this name 99% of the time refers precisely to the devil. And that's why the Vatican itself issued a statement to explain the situation. And after that, the infrared instrument came to be called just Lucy, which, although still quite strange, was much less worse than before. The fact is that this instrument, which was called Lucifer, didn't even belong to the Vatican and was just in the same place as their telescope, the VATT. And this one does belong to them and is located in an observatory in Arizona, United States. And since the Vatican had a telescope in the same observatory as the other one called LUCIFER, people made a mistaken association. But let's agree that the scientists who gave it this name were looking to cause controversy, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were orchestrating it all just for the lulz. Moving on to the next mystery involving the Vatican. You must agree with me that if a miracle happens and becomes public knowledge to thousands of people, this event would only further strengthen the faith of believers, in addition to converting atheists, thus consolidating the belief that God indeed exists. And it would be something that would greatly benefit the Vatican, as it's the largest Catholic institution in the world. However, incredibly, there have been cases where the Vatican itself tried to cover up and hide miracles from the rest of the population. And this detail once again highlights those conspiracies that supposedly the Vatican has hidden and obscure interests. But anyway, what actually happened? You've certainly seen this figure from the Catholic religion, whether in a painting or in statue form, which is the most common. Well, it's Our Lady of Fatima, said to be one of the apparitions of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ. However, to understand the Vatican's involvement with this whole story and the supposed accusation of trying to hide a miracle, we need to return to the year 1917. During this period, World War I was happening, and therefore the world was in complete chaos, with millions of people going hungry, homeless, refugees, unemployed, without money, and with an enormous economic crisis, all because of World War I. And you can imagine that this would be the ideal moment for a miracle to happen, because people were calling out to God for help more than ever when compared to previous periods where there was peace and economic prosperity. And that's precisely where a small rural village called Fatima comes in, located in Portugal. 3 children lived there who worked shepherding sheep. Their names were Lucia, 10 years old, Francisco, 9 years old, and finally Jacinta, 7 years old, the youngest of the 3. The children lived a very humble and simple life in this isolated village and had little contact with the outside world, which is why they weren't being as affected by the war compared to adults and other people who lived in cities. And perhaps it's because of these details that the children were chosen by Our Lady of Fatima, who appeared to them on the 13th of each month, in a period that lasted from May to October 1917. In the first apparition on May 13th, the children were shepherding in the field when they suddenly saw the image of Our Lady appearing in the skies majestically. She was shining brighter than the sun itself that day. Then Our Lady spoke with the children, saying they should pray every day from that day forward, asking in their prayers for World War I to end, since the conflict was causing so much suffering around the world, especially in Europe. Already on June 13th, Our Lady appeared again to the children, promising to take Francisco and Jacinta to live in heaven, while Lucia would stay longer on earth because she would receive the mission to spread the miracles and also strengthen people's faith in God. But of course, rumors of the Virgin Mary's apparition spread quickly through the cities around the small rural village of Fatima. And with this, literally thousands of people who had shaken faith and were in deep suffering because of the war and needed a miracle more than ever to motivate them, decided to travel on foot to the village of Fatima to try to witness one of the Virgin Mary's apparitions that those 3 children had supposedly witnessed. Until on October 13th, about 70,000 people were gathered in the same grazing field where the children had seen the Virgin Mary on the 13th of previous months. So for that enormous crowd of people, since it was October 13th, the saint would appear again. And on this occasion, there weren't just faithful of the Catholic religion, but several reporters who had cameras just to record the moment. Because if the miracle really happened there, they would take photos and publish news about it. In addition, there were many atheists who went there that day only out of pure curiosity and not because they had sincere faith in Catholicism. But despite this, most of the people on site were broken emotionally, physically, and spiritually, needing a miracle to continue living their lives in that complicated and difficult period. However, as the hours passed, there was no sign that the Virgin Mary would appear to that crowd of 70,000 people, and many began to lose patience and become disbelieving. Moreover, those same people were already quite tired from the long journey they had made to the village of Fatima. And to make that situation even worse, it started to rain, and thus the field's earth turned into mud, making it more difficult to remain on site. But even with all these adversities, most people continued waiting patiently with their faith intact and unshakable, just as the scriptures say. And suddenly, those people who remained on site, even with the rain, were rewarded for their faith, because out of nowhere, the rain simply stopped, the clouds went away, and the sun took over the sky. But it wasn't the sun we're used to seeing normally, but rather one that seemed to dance in the sky, emitting colored lights and putting on a visual spectacle never seen before. And since thousands of people witnessed this phenomenon at that time, including several reporters who even wrote articles in newspapers about it, this event became almost irrefutable proof that supernatural phenomena exist, in addition, of course, to canonizing Our Lady of Fatima, who received this name precisely because of the village of Fatima, where it all happened. But although the reporters couldn't take photos of the sun because it was practically impossible with the old black and white cameras of that era, they took photos of people's reactions witnessing the miracle. And in the images, you can see that several people fell to their knees and began to cry due to the immense emotion they were feeling. However, do you remember that Our Lady had told the children about taking 2 of them to live in heaven, while the other would stay alive to spread God's word? Well, it turns out that Francisco and Jacinta died young, about 3 years after the miracle happened, because they were victims of the Spanish flu. As for Lucia, she became a Carmelite nun and lived until 2005. In other words, Our Lady of Fatima's prophecy about the children's destiny was also fulfilled in the end. In fact, Lucia lived for quite a long time. By my calculations, she died at 97 years old. But the point I wanted to get to is that Our Lady revealed 3 secrets to these children that were of public interest. After all, about 70,000 people witnessed that miracle in the small village of Fatima. However, these secrets were still kept under lock and key by the Vatican, which only decided to reveal them several decades later. So, explaining what each one meant, the first secret consisted of a vision of hell that Our Lady revealed to the children with the intention of showing what would happen to those who didn't follow God's commandments. And since only Lucia lived long enough, as Francisco and Jacinta died as children, we only have her account of this vision of hell. And Lucia said the following: "We saw a great sea of fire, and plunged in this fire were demons and souls, as if they were transparent and black embers, floating in the flames, carried by the flames that came from themselves, among the screams and moans of pain and despair." But the interesting thing is that Fatima didn't show this vision with the intention of scaring the children, but to demonstrate that God actually wants to save people from this cruel fate. As for the second secret, it was a warning from Our Lady, who told the children that World War I would end soon. However, if people continued to act the same way, there would be a second war, which would be much worse than the first. And well, I think with this one, I don't even need to say what happened after that. Moreover, it's a consensus that World War II had much more cruelty and lack of humanity than the first, considering all the atrocities the Nazis committed against the Jews in the gas chambers and concentration camps. This is a new channel. I'd be grateful if you could subscribe. God bless you all.